Hello everyone and welcome back to AmmoMart, where this week your history's coming at you locked and loaded because we're going to train our sights on the Thompson Submachine Gun. She's a thirsty girl. This is one of the most legendary weapons of the 20th century. Of course, the Thompson Submachine Gun. The first 15,000 were made by Colt because the Auto Ordnance Company didn't have enough tooling to make these units at the time. Our story with the Thompson begins during and in the wake of World War I. That conflict was our planet's first glimpse into murder on an industrial scale, and it left a horrifying impression on citizen and warrior alike. One of those warriors was U.S. Army General John Thompson. General Thompson had spent the bulk of his military career in the Ordnance Department. That, combined with his experiences in World War I, convinced him that success in the next war would only come if you could have the unbridled fury of automatic weapons and the portability of a rifle. And out of that, this project was born. Originally entitled the Annihilator by General Thompson, you can kind of tell what he had in his mind when he designed it. He began around 1916 or so, laying the foundations for this platform. Eventually, he gained business support from a man named Thomas Ryan, and they started developing the weapon in the Cleveland, Ohio area, of all places, not too far from here. The lead designer on the program was a man named Theo Eickhoff. They selected the .45 ACP for the platform out of a long series of trial and error. It was the only one suited for the delayed friction blowback system that Thompson operates on. They were hoping for a locked breech design using something called the Blish friction system, which never really worked to begin with. It uses the concept of static friction. But by 1917, that technology had played itself out, and they switched to this operating system. It's worth noting that even though this was designed and was even originally called the trench broom, its entry into World War I would be delayed. They didn't have all of the bugs worked out until 1918, and by then, World War I had been resolved. Though designed to be used in trenches, this design never made it. Believe it or not, in a cruel twist of fate, 2 days before the prototypes were due to ship to Europe, the Great War came to an end. So, what would one do with a project like this, nicknamed the Annihilator, in a peacetime setting? Well, to be quite honest with you, nobody was really sure. Beginning in 1921 to 1923, Colt made the first Model M 1921A. This, of course, is not that. This is a later version found in World War II. However, there are some stark similarities except for the foregrip and some other things we'll talk about later. Believe it or not, the Thompson wasn't widely accepted when it was originally released. The military passed on the design. They found in a peacetime setting that it was too heavy. That's why I just set it down. It is. It was too aggressive. And more importantly, it was just too doggone expensive to make it worth the while. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to Temperance, and it was called Prohibition. Gangsters absolutely loved the Model M 1921. They had deep pockets, they had a need for the auto fire, and let's be honest, a really, really destructive appetite for it. The Thompson at the time was a statement, more so than a weapon. In fact, its fearsome reputation and the sound that it makes when it's being used, it quickly became known as the Chicago typewriter. In fact, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was actually committed by members of the Al Capone gang using M 1921As. You see, Prohibition caused two-bit hoodlums like Capone, John Dillinger, and Machine Gun Kelly to become overnight millionaire bootleggers and thieves, and they would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Soon, law enforcement was forced to adopt the platform just to keep pace, and the FBI did after the Kansas City Massacre in 1933. It is worth noting, however, that local law enforcement seemed to be attracted to the platform before the feds. In fact, the Thompson's first use in actual combat came on July 13, 1921, when the West Virginia State Troopers used the platform to quell a miners' strike. Sometime around 1928, fate would allow the U.S. Postal Service to buy 30 or 40 of these units and actually issue them to United States Marines that were charged with protecting mail shipments during the Depression. That's an interesting thing to note for the life of the Thompson and auto ordnance, because all of a sudden the Navy got a little more interested in it. However, they wanted the system tweaked a little bit to a lower cyclic rate of fire from 8 to 600, and they changed some things like this flat forearm instead of the pistol grip. While I have her in the air, this thing was completely space-agey state-of-the-art when it was designed. A fin barreled for cooling, sleek stock, and I'll show you a version later on that's way more collectible with the pistol grip design. Completely innovative, certainly for 1921 and into 1928. You'll notice here's another thing of note looking at this platform. The original versions made by Colt wouldn't have been manufactured with the cuts compensator. You could get one later on, and it was called the 21AC. One of the reasons why this was a statement and a status symbol was the cost of the weapon, even in 1921, was extremely high, roughly $200, which is right around $3,500 in today's market. Now, a lot of people would say $3,500 for a machine gun is very affordable, but you can see it was designed for people with deep pockets, law enforcement, and obviously gangsters that were always flush with cash. Some served on the side of law and order, and some didn't, is probably the best way to categorize the Thompson submachine gun. It did, however, serve for decades in militaries all over the world. It served us well in World War II, all the way through the Vietnam era. In fact, the FBI were still using the platform into the early 1970s until theirs were ordered obsolete and then destroyed. So as you can see, the controls for the Thompson were pretty complex for the day. You had a frame-mounted mechanical safety as well as a fire selector switch, which would go from full auto to full auto to single. It could be fired semi-automatic. I'm not sure how often people did that, but it could be done, I imagine, to improve your accuracy or conserve ammo. One of the downsides to the Thompson is that it does not retain a whole lot of accuracy past 50 yards, but keep in mind, it wasn't designed for that. If I can, I'm going to try to roll this up and hopefully get into the camera where you do have adjustable sights on the platform. This is a notch, there is a peep. Quite complex looking, but it never really helped the accuracy of the platform to any degree whatsoever. This is also an interesting feature, which is this, at the time, an ergonomic magazine release. Of course, they didn't care who was left-handed in the world at the time. Ambidextrous controls wasn't a thing. So imagine you being a right-handed shooter, you could just sort of lift up on this with your thumb and release the magazine, which was kind of an innovative feature for the time. Quite complex. That was the other thing that drove up the cost of the Thompson, was very complex, hard to make, and over the course of time ultimately led to its undoing, because with the advent of lighter and simpler automatic battle rifles, helped usher this thing into legend. You can see the military variant that I have here. The history of this weapon is pretty interesting. The owner of it is on site, of course, just to stay in ATF compliance. This is what's known as a 1928 A2. And at that time, you would have had 20 or 30 round stick magazines. The military decided early on that the drum was way too inefficient and way too heavy. It was hard to march with when the weapon was slung. They were temperamental, and it took a lot of engineering and fidgety to be able to wind the drum correctly. And when you got done, you had an even heavier weapon, which begins its life empty at slightly more than 10 pounds. So, not for the faint of heart if you want to carry this guy. The Thompson submachine gun was also one of the first platforms to use a sort of double stack magazine system. Very innovative for the time. as I said, you could get 20 or 30 rounders. But as the user of the platform, you had to be very, very conscious of the fact that she was a very, very thirsty girl. It's a little bit of a myth that it was user-friendly. It required a lot of training and discipline to get good with this. You can get on YouTube and Google and watch old videos of instructors actually being able to write cursive with this platform once you had enough training. I, of course, don't. This is my first contact with the thing, so I won't be near that good. One of the other things that kind of made the Thompson a little different was it fires from the open bolt position, like a lot of machine guns, which means the first press of the trigger releases the bolt, and it just reciprocates as long as your finger is on the trigger. Okay. So we're just going to lean in. Hopefully you can see the open bolt design of the gun, and watch how quickly we can burn through some ammo. It's impressive. One over the shoulder and she's empty. For me, the weapon, you can see, might be the way I'm operating it, has a tendency to go up and to the left. So I'll try to oversteer, so to speak, with the next magazine. Ownership of this guy would almost certainly require you to be independently wealthy, in that this copy here is easily worth $40,000. Some of the more collectible ones are worth $70,000 to $100,000, depending on its history, provenance, and all things like that. Then, coupled with the fact that that cost and the high cost to me of 45 ACP, this is not a cheap weapon system by any stretch of the imagination, but oh so cool. The Thompson Submachine Gun has a very, very interesting history in American folklore. It's actually just as big of a character as anybody in any car gang of the time, and any of the feds that would be using it, say Melvin Purvis and those types, working for the FBI. What you have here is a weapon designed to take human life quickly, and it did. It's unfortunate that all of the corpses stinking up the 1920s was the only reason why the federal government sat up and took notice. As I mentioned, this is an extremely valuable example of the Colt M1921. One of the anomalies with this particular unit is, of course, the cuts compensator. The serial number on the Colt is 8188, roughly just past halfway of its 15,000 unit production run. However, you can see with the display, you do have the drum magazines as well as the stick magazines. This one actually used to belong to the Kenton, Ohio Police Department. During Prohibition in the Roaring '20s, Kenton, Ohio was actually known as Little Chicago because of the bootlegging activity and the violence that brought. These guns were actually sold to local law enforcement by the federal government and sometimes direct from Colt/Auto Ordnance, so they would have a fighting chance against car gangs. I'm not going to get this one off the wall. We do have some close-up pictures of its Colt stampings, and you can see here was where it would be designated Colt M1921. One of the major differences between the one we shot on the video and this one, of course, is this pistol grip. Everything else remained roughly the same, and you can see the condition of this one is in a much better state. For those of you that might be mildly curious, the dollar value on something in this condition with its history ranges somewhere between $65,000 to perhaps as much as $100,000 if you can find one. I personally believe that the cuts compensator was put on later. It's worth noting that in some production runs from Auto Ordnance, that was actually an increase in price of right around $50. For instance, if you got a later version that came with it, it was $225. The ones without it would be $175. This, of course, being a Colt, wouldn't have originally had one, and it was added sometime later. If I can get it on camera, you'll see it actually dates the cuts compensator from 1926. I don't believe throughout American history that you could find a more iconic and legendary firearm so associated with a period of time. Lever action rifles, whether they were made by Winchester or Ruger, survived decades and decades of American use. Yes, of course, you could hold one up and go, look, the Old West. But I don't think any one particular firearm more identifies with an era more perfectly than the Chicago typewriter.